Hello and welcome to the CAPS Unlock podcast. I'm Peter Leonard, Communications Director at CAPS Unlock, a think tank based in Almaty, Kazakhstan. This is the second in a short series I'm recording on the sidelines of a major history conference here in Astana, hosted at Nazarbayev University. The title, Toward New Transnational Trans-Imperial Histories of Central Asia, suggests a turning point in the field. In this episode, I want to raise a provocation. Perhaps the scholarly phase of nation-making is behind us. The groundwork, how nations in Central Asia were defined, how categories hardened, how some groups disappeared, has already been laid extensively. Your books, the people present in this room with me, and they're there for anyone who wants to read the full story, have, I think, covered that story very, very well. And my provocative question now is whether we've reached the end of that nation-building conversation and what comes next. And to explore this, I've invited three distinguished guests: Adeeb Khalid, Professor of Asian Studies and History at Carleton College, whose work has shaped our understanding of Islam and identity in Russian and Soviet Central Asia. And then next we have Adrienne Edgar, Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who has written extensively on Soviet nationality policy and the making of nations, and Dr Javeed Ahwar, a historian at Nazarbayev University whose research has focused on early and modern South and Central Asia. So before moving on to my provocation, I wanted to start with an even more basic question for you, Professor Edgar. In the popular consciousness about Central Asia, the prevailing story of Soviet Republic formation is that these nations were created in a slapdash fashion by a pencil-wielding Lenin and Stalin in some late-night Kremlin session. Why has that story proved so compelling and so resistant to revision?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know why it has proven resistant to revision. I think it's proven compelling because people like the idea of Lenin and Stalin wielding pencils and, changing borders of Central Asia, on a whim. As you probably know, if you've been reading the books that have come out in the last 20 years, that wasn't really the story. That in fact the borders of the Central Asian republics were worked out in extensive negotiations between Moscow and a number of elites on the ground who argued and horse traded and bargained over who would get which city, who would get where the borders would be exactly as the republics were being created. Yes, I guess I can't really say anything else about why the story has proven resistant to change, except that often popular ideas about things are resistant to, revision based on the work of scholars.
And then, Professor Khalid, let me pose the cheekier question, which I opened with. Is the nation-building conversation, I've rather presumptuously framed the conversation in these terms, do you think that it's approaching the end of the road? My launching pad for that question is the very title of this conference. I think it's transnational is the word that I sort of got stuck on. I'm wondering whether this suggests that historians are now looking at the next chapter of this whole subject.
I would say yes and no. The conversation among historians, I think, a lot of stuff has been thrashed out, but the trans-imperial and transnational in the title, in some ways, are nods to bigger trends in current historiography, where we are supposed to think beyond the nation state. And that is not the same conversation as how nation states came about. So in that sense, the nation-building conversation most of it has been thrashed out, but I don't think it's necessarily the end of the road. But thinking beyond those single national borders is, a bigger agenda in the field of history. And in that sense, I think that the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
What is the agenda, though? Is it an attempt to dismantle notions of what building a nation implies about the places in which people live today?
Not necessarily. I think when people talk about thinking beyond the nation state, that is the phenomena we are studying and the experiences of the people we are studying are not shaped solely by the nation state. And there are bigger forces that continue to exist, like global economic forces, flows of goods and trade and commerce and ideas. And that's a somewhat different set of questions than how nations and states come about and how national identities are built.
Dr. Ahwar, your work at least what of it. I was exposed to, in your very interesting talk yesterday here at Nazarbayev University, took us to people who don't neatly fit into the national story, groups like Sarts. And I would incidentally ask you, maybe for those of our listeners who don't know what Sarts are, to explain in 30 seconds or less what exactly that term means. Your research suggests that there are still fundamental questions we haven't resolved about who got written into the nation and who got written out. So these are questions that sit rather awkwardly with today's drift towards ethnically homogenous national identities in Central Asia, and contemporary Central Asia. And now the discipline of history feels a bit like a provocation in that respect.
Thank you for that question. With the advent of nationalism in Central Asia and the neighborhood, nationalization of history also took place, and it kind of forced the state to define the nation as a homogeneous body of or community of people, and it required them also somehow to encourage them to either deny the existence of other groups or somehow promote the idea of homogenization through erasing certain identities or assimilating certain identities. So the idea of Sarts or Kipchak or Kyrgyz or other tribes which existed in the past, they seem to disappear during the early Soviet history, considering that the project was to create larger identities that they would encompass certain other groups. And when we talk about Uzbek, modern Uzbek identity, it encompasses several tribes which were in war with each other. For example, the Kongrats and the Kyrgyz and the Mangrids and the Mings, I cannot go into giving so many examples of these wars and conflicts, but it definitely created a lot of question, like what about the presence of these unique groups within these nations? Where is Kyrgyz today in Uzbekistan? Where is the Khongrat? Where is the Ming? Where is the all these groups which had unique identity and unique history? Somehow the idea of national borders also dictated some sort of control over population and control over information and control over the creation of narratives. But I think with the advent of digital media and all the stuff, things are looking much more. There are a lot of possibilities. I give the example of Afghanistan that in the last 20 years with the free speech created some sort of opportunities for ethnic groups which were not feeling part of the country, and they started also discussing and criticizing the national homogenization project which was implemented by the government. So there is a possibility that the ethnic groups which were excluded from the national narrative, and they might come out if freedom of speech is guaranteed in the future. But if not, then diaspora can, to some extent, compensate for that.
Professor Edgar, can we get back to the basics of this conversation again? Many will and do contend that, as we were discussing earlier, the nations of Central Asia, so let's make this a very Central Asia-focused conversation, were Soviet inventions, right? And the counter could be that this was part of a broader global process of identity formation. So if Moscow hadn't drawn the borders, would national states have crystallized here anyway? That's the idea. So who's right?
Yes, so you're absolutely right that this was, the period when the nations of Central Asia were created, when the borders were drawn, was a period of broader nation formation. In the interwar period, there were a lot of new nations. After World War I, there were Wilsonian principles of self-determination. The Soviet Union, in its desire to create nations, although it was doing it for different reasons than, say, President Wilson. The Soviet Union was, yes, there was a broader process of nation formation. Yes, and the nation state is after empires collapsed after World War I, most of them, the nation state became the predominant way of organizing human communities. So from that perspective, you could argue that nation states would have appeared in Central Asia in some form, probably. Whether or not they would have taken exactly the form that they took under the Soviet Union, though, I think is much more debatable, because the Soviets had a specific idea of nationality that was based on not just territory but also on language and kind of a certain idea of ethnicity that was a very European definition, arguably, and it created the states of the nation states of Central Asia based on ideas of nationhood that were not necessarily common or inherent to the region. So there could have been states based. I mean, Adeeb can speak to this. There could have been, a Bukharan state, or there could have been other kinds of. There wouldn't necessarily have been a Turkmenistan, an Uzbekistan, a Tajikistan, and so forth, without the Soviets kind of pushing things in that direction. I don't know if you guys agree with me, but that's my sense.
Well, I mean, there were the idea of the nation as an ethnic and cultural entity was here in Central Asia among activists before the Soviets. So the will to nationalization was there. Whether that would have resulted in exactly these boundaries and these 5 nation states, that's not at all given. But the idea of the nation was not imposed by the Soviets. Its terms were perhaps defined, but the Soviet definition of the nation as based on language, territory, and culture is the most generic form of romantic European nationalism of the 19th century. That was also very attractive to a lot of local activists.
So, Professor Khalid, I mean, this potentially brings us into choppy waters, because my reflection from the decades of coming to Central Asia is that, okay, there's this identity which is sort of engineered, and then it's in some respects, I don't want to overstate it, but it has many aspects have been engineered, and I would say either whether it be through cinema or music or even the reinvention of ceramics, which is a subject I'm particularly fascinated in. And so now the successor states have taken that imagined nation and have claimed it to be some sort of primordial, pre-existing reality, which is a very odd situation we're in, right?
Well, this is actually more common than one would think. All nations are constructed. The scaffolding is more visible in Central Asia than in many other places, but there are no natural nations anywhere. And all national identities are the result of some sort of social engineering. We just use the term social engineering for other people, not for ourselves. But, one of the major landmarks in the history of nationalism was a book called Peasants into Frenchmen. The idea that even French national identity, which many of us take as obvious and natural and not engineered, is the product of the French state.
Well, I would venture to say that France is not a real country, but anyway, let's not go down that.
But then there are no real countries.
But some are less real than others. So, Dr. Ahwar, at the risk of stating the obvious, our conversation is a reminder that history is almost always about the present, in actual fact, which makes me wonder, should scholarly conversations about nation and ethnicity come with a brighter warning label, given how politically charged they remain in Central Asia today?
I do agree. Yeah, there is a possibility that what the scholars outside of Central Asia produce might be used by the state to reify their versions of nationalism and impose a certain definition of nationalism. Especially methodological nationalism is some sort of reimposing the idea that there is an Uzbek nation, that there is a Tajik nation, there is a Kazakh nation, without really critically reflecting on the components of these ideas. The idea of Afghan nationalism or Afghan as an identity, some suggests that there is a group of people who are homogenous and they exist, and this is the definition that which states want to promote. I think scholars can take a more critical stance on this, and especially when we talk about civic nationalism, ideas of Kazakhstani or Uzbekistani or Afghanistani, it needs to be somehow embraced by academia, and instead of taking the side of elitist nationalism or elitist politics, which is very easy and it is sort of like catching with academia, it is better that at some point in time we need to critically reflect, like maybe our, the way we discuss about states, the way we discuss and write about the states might reify government's position and might really help them suppress certain identities within those nations and within those countries. So because all these nations are composed of different ethnic groups, and there is no homogeneous state in the neighborhood. But if we take a little bit far from, go a little bit far from Central Asia, countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, they do not deny the existence of different ethnic groups, which is a good idea, and they can borrow from that example, and they be a little bit at ease with the existence of other nationalities within the territory, and rather than, for example, defining Uzbekistan as a Turkic nation or Tajikistan as Aryan nation. I think it's better that they would embrace some sort of inclusive version of a national narrative that would say we are composed of different ideas and different people and different paths and different narratives, and allow to develop, to let different versions of narratives to come out. Because if we go by the idea of defining nationalism as nations as imagined communities, then let other imaginations come out. Because at the moment, it looks like the states is really pushing for one sort of imagination, one sort of narrative to be promoted internationally, and somehow that's catching up with academia.
Though sadly, it seems as though a lot of the world is unfortunately going in the other direction. I think that criticism can be applied across the board. So I just want to end our conversation by looping back a little bit to the provocation I threw out there, which I think has been roundly scotched from what I can tell. If the nation-building conversation, though, is evolving into something new and different, what comes next? What new questions should historians of Central Asia be asking, and where do you see the most exciting directions for the field? And anyone can pick that up.
Yeah, well, there was something I wanted to say when you posed your provocative question earlier, and I didn't have a chance to say, which is that there are, in some sense, the field has moved on from looking at nation making, which was of great interest to people. You talked about how the present, helps to drive the questions about the past. After the Soviet Union collapsed, people were very interested in where all these new nations came from, and hence the scholarly interest in nation making. But I would say, within a decade or so after that conversation started, people started saying, but wait a minute, yes, the Soviet Union collapsed, but it existed for 7 decades, and what held it together? So scholars started researching the transnational aspects of the Soviet Union, things like the Soviet identity, the idea of a Soviet people, friendship of peoples, and Soviet internationalism, in order to, kind of look at the flip side of the question. Yes, there were nations that arose in the Soviet Union, but there were also these more universal transnational ideas, and there was a kind of a super-ethnic civic identity as well. So that has been a trend in the field as well. That is kind of where the conversation went. And I'd say it's still there to some extent. People are still talking about this a lot. What do you guys think? Where is it going to go next? Any thoughts?
The Soviet Union is now firmly in the rear view mirror. And at some point, I think we will start talking about other forms of transnationalism. Since this is a Central Asia-focused conversation, maybe Central Asia's connections with other parts of the world and other forms of internationalism or cosmopolitanism that are with us today. So that's one of the possibilities I can think of.
I do agree with him. Actually, it is very much possible to transcend beyond this definition of regions, like when we define Central Asia as a Soviet Central Asia, that is, it encompasses only 5 republics. If we extend the definition and include, for example, Xinjiang, Afghanistan, or to some extent even in some parts of Pakistan, because these regions have been ruled by Central Asian rulers, and there's overlap. Babur is buried in Kabul, so and they ruled over India. So the Mughal culture and the Mughal idea of even the Mughal cuisine, which is still alive in Delhi, in India, shows how impactful Central Asian culture and Central Asian politics have been in the region. So I have been inspired by Bukharan intellectuals who are very much in favor of rewriting history for the region. For example, Abdul Karim Bukhari, for example, writes a history of Hukumranani, for example, the rulers of Bukhara, Hokan, and Kabul, and so they were trained to think in that way. But somehow the historians abandoned that tradition and started thinking only in terms of, as Professor Khalid and Professor Edgar was mentioning, that they started thinking in terms of like limited borders and delimited borders, and they could not transcend beyond that definition given to them. So, but the opportunity is there if we just allow ourselves to explore different dimensions of this history. I have been doing comparative study of three different figures, Tarzi from Afghanistan and Fitrat from Uzbekistan and Aini from Tajikistan, to see how mutually they have been influencing each other and the way they were thinking at the time. So it's really fascinating to see that they were really borrowing ideas from each other, that they were learning, even if they were positioned against each other at some point in time. So it is very much possible to think beyond the national borders and even transcend beyond the regional definitions, and include certain other countries in that definition, as I mentioned.
Our organization is called Caps Unlock, and people ask what that means, because it is a bit of a strange name, but the name comes from Central Asia policy studies, and unlock comes from the idea that Central Asia is landlocked and our goal is to unlock it, is to bridge it to other parts of the world, and that's kind of our North Star. So thank you very much, I think, all three of you, for bringing us to that conclusion to the conversation, because I think it's made the point very, very elegantly and very succinctly. So thank you to you all, and thank you to our listeners, and we'll be back with you in a week from now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.